Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here and starting out your Saturday with us. I think this is going to be a really fantastic panel. I feel very honored to be on stage with these fine folks. So I'm just going to get right to it. I'll start by letting you know who I am. My name is Stephanie Llamas. I work for a research company called Superdata Research. And essentially, my job is to be a VR nerd. So I'm really excited to be here. And let's just go down the line, and you guys can introduce yourselves.
I'm Kimberlee Archer. I'm representing Samsung here today. I oversee our marketing and go-to-market strategy for the Gear VR, as well as our partnerships and our experiences that we create in virtual reality.
And I'm Bjorling. I'm a creative technical director at a production studio called Here Be Dragons. We produce AR and VR. And I'm also a co-founder and partner in within a VR platform.
Hi, I'm Svetlana Dragayeva, and I'm the CEO of Fountain Digital Labs, a London-based company, and we develop conscious digital projects. And VR-wise, we created Virry VR, Felder Wild and Virry VR Wild Encounters, and it's our first attempt to democratize wildlife and bring it close and personal to all of you, hopefully.
And I'm Nick Felder. I'm the global head of film and music production for Coca-Cola. We've got various VR efforts happening around the world, and I was a very early proponent of this medium and continue to be so.
Great, really exciting. So before we get started, I want to know how many of you have actually tried VR?
Yay!
Excellent.
Excellent.
Good turnout.
The good news is that those of you who haven't, there's plenty of really great experiences at the fair, so I hope you guys get a chance to try those. So I think quickly, maybe you guys can explain a little bit like what VR is for somebody who hasn't tried it before. I mean, just what should they think about and get excited about with VR if they have no clue what it is? We'll start with Kimberlee.
Well, VR is basically a digital simulated environment in which you have agency to interact within that particular environment. And that can be computer generated like HTC Vive or the Oculus Rift, or it can be powered by your smartphone like we have with the Samsung Gear VR. So the Samsung Gear VR, of course, is the leader in the mobile virtual reality space. And in our partnership with Oculus, we have a wide variety of applications that ranges from video, games, photography, social. There's about over 750 apps available, and that continues to expand. So there's definitely a lot of experiences out there for you guys to take in.
What's the difference between 360 and VR experiences?
Well, a VR experience is, virtual reality is the substitution of one or more sensory inputs so you're not getting the input of real reality, you were getting synthetic inputs, synthetic stimuli to one or more of your senses. And that can be done through a lot of different ways, right? So it can be something that is entirely computer generated, it can be something that is captured in the real world. Now, so this camera right here, for example, that is live streaming in 360, it is a stereoscopic camera, so you get a slightly different image for left and right eye, which affords you depth perception in the content. That is one step further than just a regular 360. But the difference to me between 360 and VR is just how you view it. You can view this content in a rectangle and click and drag to pan around on Facebook 360 or YouTube 360, but that's not VR because you are not inhabiting the depicted space. It is not replacing the sensory input of the real world. You're still in the real world just looking at a rectangle. If you're in a headset, that can be entirely valid as a VR experience. And like agency is important, to your point, but we don't always have agency in the real world either. We're not always able to affect what is going on around us. So I think there can be really, really compelling experiences that are sort of all entirely passive, but done with real world capture. But we're also going towards a future where real world capture will afford you agency, will afford you the ability to move around in that captured space.
So with VR, I mean, there's a lot of back and forth in terms of media or public opinion as to whether or not it's going in the right direction, or there's this trough of disillusionment and so on. So essentially, there's the question of why VR, and I think Svetlana, it would be great to start with you. Why are your experiences in particular? Why is VR the only way that people should experience that?
In our case, VR is all about making impossible possible, and that's why it's VR. Because it's always a good question to ask, like, why making some content in VR? What does it add? What is the added value? Does it actually make sense? Because it's kind of lame to make VR just for the purpose of VR, because it's such a popular thing now. And in our case, since we wanted to bring all those wild creatures close and personal to you, and we wanted a lion to lick you, for example, we could only make it in VR. And the meaning behind all this is how can you make something that distant close so that you actually care about it? Because why should you care about African wildlife here in New York when it's so far away from you? And why should you actually do something about saving wildlife, for example? And in our case, we were all about how to bring those wild creatures to interact with you, and so that you have a chance to be really close and feed wild animals, but without harming these animals. So you actually build an emotional bond without being physically there or disturbing animals, and still it's a very powerful emotional thing for you.
Yeah, definitely. And that kind of makes me think a little bit about brands or Coca-Cola products that are interested in going into VR. I mean, what is it about VR that attracted you? I know you've been early on the VR train, and Coca-Cola is looking at a lot of really innovative ways to participate. But what do you think VR is going to do that other media can't do for Coca-Cola?
Sure, good question. So when we first got in, we've probably done a couple of dozen different experiences, different efforts around the world over the last couple of years. And I think for us and for our products, we'll be in the content space, we'll always be in the content space. But I think really, because you touched on it earlier, one of the things that really attracted us was, can we provide access, right? That's still the trough. How many people, if you have one of these, can you experience VR in Vietnam, in Zimbabwe, in Benin? Like, what can we do with that? And we started to look into a number of ways to can we make a VR viewer? If Google Cardboard is a piece of cardboard with two lenses, you can buy it for $15, can we use our recycled case material, say a 20-can fridge pack, and put in just a couple of lenses and let the consumer make their own viewer? If you've got one of these, 90% of the VR content is now available to you for the price of a 2 6-packs. It presents the unfortunate part of that is we don't have cardboard in all parts of the world. A lot of parts of the world, it's just shrink wrapped, or they're sold loose on a shelf, or it's glass bottles sold in a hard case. You've got to return. So we're looking at ways to do things, make plastic viewers out of recycled PET. And I could go on and on, but getting into the access business, because if you've got one of these and you're in rural China, if you're in Sri Lanka, if you're in a tough part of the world, having that experience, it's such a premium magical experience for you to be able to see things that otherwise you just won't have access to. Clouds over Sidra that these guys made, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Your experiences with the African wildlife, all that stuff. Can we have a hand in bringing that to folks and make that leap past having the gear?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's this concern that when you're in VR, you're isolated, you're kind of, it's a non-social platform. Do you guys agree with that, Kimberlee?
Yeah, no. I think VR is probably going to evolve into being one of the most social platforms, given the sense that you have presence and you have perspective within the medium, and you're also there with others. So, I mean, we've launched our social platform where you're able to play games with others, you're able to sit down and watch movies, like, for instance, with Hulu, the Hulu app, you can sit on the couch with your virtual avatar, you can have conversations, you can steal the remote from the person, you can watch your favorite shows and talk about it as you're watching it. So that's happening in a space where that person can be in LA right now with me doing that experience. there's opportunity to meet people in VR. So going into what we used to call the old school chat rooms, at the wave of the internet, onset of the internet, we have that in VR, where you go into these rooms based on your interests, and you mingle with people across the world, you talk to them about their interests, and it's so amazing that you're able to not only meet with your friends, but you're also able to meet people within the VR space. So it's exciting, and we're only on the beginning and the infancy within those types of technology. So we're leaning on the creators and the developers in the space to really evolve what the platform can do and how we can leverage those the baseline technology to create exciting experiences moving forward.
So why doesn't everyone in the world have VR?
Well, it is generation 1, right? So it is the first generation of the consumer hardware. So there's always going to be a slowness of adoption with that. So to be blunt, in some cases, generation 1 isn't, fulfilling all the promises of a technology, and that's also the case with VR. We are at the early days of it, and which means it is more expensive than it will ultimately be. It is less capable than it will ultimately be. I would say it's capable of doing things that no other medium can do right now, and there are amazing experiences out there. And even if the hardware never evolved one step further, we would keep making more and more amazing things with it, because it's so early. So many major players have yet to make their efforts in VR. So it will get to mass adaptation, but it is also, you mentioned this before, it is sort of, to the question around social, it is kind of isolating in the sense that another person in the room, if your hearing and your vision is now taken over by the VR interface, they are gone to you, and it's a weird thing to do at home when there are other people around. Mm-hmm. And for room scale type stuff, you ideally want a 10 by 10 space or more, and especially with New York rent, not everyone's going to afford to have a spare room for VR. So there are those obstacles for the take-up.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And then, initially with any new medium, there's the price boundary, so a lot of the more advanced technology requires a computer and et cetera. And that's why Samsung was more passionate about, democratizing VR and getting it out there to the masses. If you already have a cell phone, why not leverage that cell phone as a VR machine? And so that was pretty much our angle in terms of, we have millions of cell phones out there. How do we transform your phone into a VR experience? And that's really where we felt that's one of the entry points and the easiest way to get it out there to the masses. But the problem is people are hesitant to try. So I'm excited that this room is filled with people that have tried it, but the average person, 80% of the population has never tried a VR experience. And so without trial, they don't understand what the experiences are like. They don't see the impact and the value. They only can hear us talk about, how great and marvelous it is.
Right, and it's virtually impossible to explain what VR is if you haven't tried it,
yes.
Right? So it's not like AR. I feel like AR is so straightforward. There's a lot of excitement. I mean, it's more accessible, obviously, because it'll be on phones, but you can kind of explain to someone, imagine if there was something in front of you that was digital that was kind of interacting with your reality. How do you explain that VR is something, how do you explain what that feels like? And I feel like the first time you get into VR, it's just, you know that whatever everyone's told you, you couldn't have known what that would feel like. So yeah, I think that's a huge barrier to entry. And going back to AR a little bit, I'm curious to know, where do you see the line in terms of VR being more valuable or VR being more essential than AR? Because AR is kind of the hot topic right now with Apple and Google. Why are we talking about VR right now?
So VR is not that hot anymore? Now you're telling me this?
I mean, in terms of just the news, in terms of people out there, I feel like there's a lot of people who are still not as sold with VR as they are with AR.
I think VR and AR give you different opportunities and possibilities, and AR is absolutely a wonderful, amazing thing because it will actually create a new reality, a blended reality, which ultimately becomes your only reality, which is, I find it beautiful. And when it comes to VR, I actually love the fact that it can be isolating, but in a good way. I mean, we're so social these days, and I think it's great that you can run away for 10 or 15 minutes and actually be with yourself in a way. So it's a matter of content when it comes to VR, but I love this idea that you can just, I don't know, chill by the river and actually think, contemplate a little bit. So I don't need to be social at that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and it makes me kind of think, you know, with AR, it's a little bit clearer, I think, how brands can participate without being kind of beating over your head that the brands are there in certain respects, whereas VR, it's a little bit trickier, right? So what are ways that you've seen, you know, either with Coca-Cola or thought about that brands can participate in a way that's not intrusive to that isolating experience?
No, it's a huge question. I mean, I think the way we tend to think about it, I think AR's got a lot more practical. It's much more of a functional,
utilitarian medium.
Utilitarian, practical, and that's great. There's all kinds of practical stuff you can do. You know, I've got Map Finder on my phone. Okay, I want to get a fountain drink in our case, or really anything. Like, you can add some overlay, and there it is. It appears, and it's easy. VR is the ultimate kind of deep dive or fanboy experience. You know, if you're really into NASCAR, you're really into cars, and you get a VR, you can walk around the pits, you can go underneath the car, you can look under the hood, you can see all, right? I have no interest in doing that, but they're absolutely right. Or you're into saving wild, or Korean boy bands, like whatever your thing is, with VR, you can go down that rabbit hole and be backstage with them. Something you'll probably never get to do in real life, right? Or in that NASCAR pit, or we were talking the other day on the phone, like in a medical, so I don't hear out of my right ear, I've got nothing in there, I've been to a lot of medical doctors, like with VR, instead of seeing that bad little plaster thing on my doctor's desk, or he can show me a video, he's like, put these on, let me walk you into your ear and show you exactly what's going on. This is what's there, this is what we can and can't fix. You know, touch that, it's tender, right? See, that's why you need to keep your cholesterol, whatever. So it's that, and that is just mind-blowing, mind-popping stuff that makes it visceral and real, and suddenly, now I'm listening to everything my doctor said instead of like the bad little plaster thing on his desk, right? So it's magic, sorry.
Yeah, no. I totally agree, and I think what's interesting about VR and what we saw sort of with smartphones, with all kinds of technology, is that when it started, people thought it was cool, it was novel, but couldn't really see what the next 5, 10, 20 years look like, why it's so transformative, right? So why do you guys think it's transformative? What does 5, 10, 20 years look like for VR?
I think, so we're on a trajectory. So we're dealing with vision and hearing right now, crudely, but we're getting there. We have spatialized audio that is, all right, but that can get better. The resolution can get better. The fidelity of what we're rendering or shooting with cameras can get better. And ultimately, we'll deal with other senses. So there is this ultimate incarnation of the medium where a virtual reality is indistinguishable from real reality. Like, it is sufficiently believable that we can't immediately tell what's what. We've gotten there with special effects in movies. We'll get there with entire worlds in VR, inhabitable worlds in VR. And that might sound utopian, and it's like, how can that even be possible? Because what about smell? What about the feeling of sun hitting our skin in a warm scene in the forest? Like, we'll get there. We will get there. And we're eating away at these things all the time. Like, today we're much closer to that than 3 months ago, and certainly than like 4 years ago or 5 years ago when I started doing this. So it's happening at a really amazing pace. So I can't predict 5 or 10 or 20 years because it's moving so fast. But I do believe we will be able to completely fool ourselves. And if you've tried like walk out on a ledge in VR and look down and like your knees freeze, your knees lock out, even though you know you're on a safe floor, you know you could just take a step out. Consciously, you're completely aware. But you can't make your body do it because we've fooled your reptile brain. We've fooled you on one level. We'll keep fooling you on higher and higher levels until it's like, no, I only know this is VR because I have a memory of putting on whatever contraption conveys the experience.
Absolutely. Well, I want to, oh, sorry, did you want to say
Yeah, and I also think it'll be mainstream when your everyday tasks are then made easier by VR. So, right now you may do online shopping. You can't try on clothes online, but you can do that in VR. You may be shopping for makeup. You want to see the different colors. We don't want to go through all of that. You can just see what you look like in VR, before you purchase. So they're just things that, I felt like the evolution of the smartphone was basically once you got to the point where your computer was your phone, was your Walkman and everything put together, that's the reason why it got adopted to the masses and people started to build content for the platform because they realized that people are going to be carrying these devices. So that's pretty much my cry to all of the creators and the developers out there that it will become mass, and so you can start now creating those types of experiences and those types of use cases that make it more relevant and more beneficial to the average person in their day-to-day life.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if I could add, in a single word, I think it's convergence, right? What I see in my phone, what I see in my computer, what I see in my TV at home, those are all coming together in different ways, and how I get whatever that is, that's changing. AR and VR are just another piece of that, and it's, right, these might actually have a chip in them, and I get in 5 years, and I get my AR information when I put these on, right? It's all just coming together in different ways, convergence.
Do you guys think that's creepy?
No, it's wonderful. I think for me the most interesting thing is to see how actually human creativity can challenge the medium and use the medium and all the possibilities that the medium offers, because I think this is still a quite tricky thing, because a human being is always the biggest problem, but also the biggest possibility, and it would be wonderful to see more high quality, meaningful content so that the question why VR doesn't even pop up, and that's a challenge for humans who work in this industry, I think, which is great.
Yeah. I want to open it up to the audience. Do any of you have questions for our panelists? Yes.
Do we have a mic? We're going to get you a mic. Oh.
Test. All right.
Do you want me to stand up?
You can do whatever you want to do.
If you get it so close to being able to tell between real life and virtual reality, do you think it could somehow warp into almost a dystopian feel? Almost, I guess, Matrix for cliche.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're getting towards something like that. We still have our biological needs for now, and that's we're gonna have to deal with those somehow. You have dirty minds if you're laughing at that. I thought about food, but all right. So there's going to be all of those things that we're going to have to deal with anyway. But any powerful technology can be abused. Anything. We're seeing terrorist attacks using trucks driving into people. Like that doesn't mean that trucks are bad. That means that we need to foster a culture that understands the value of using things in the right way, and just respect and compassion and those sort of humanistic values. And I think VR is really good at conveying those things. Conveying empathy, conveying compassion, and conveying understanding for other people. So hopefully VR is able to disarm itself to some extent. But I'm old enough to remember when the original Doom came out in '93, and all of the really harsh criticism that got, because you could chainsaw demons in the gut, even though it was just looks like garbled pixels to us today. And then eventually there was a school shooting. The Columbine shooters had built their school as a Doom level before they did the shooting. They had rehearsed in the game. And then that was much later, but then we had a second round of condemnation for the game. And VR will have its Columbine moment. Someone will do something in meat space and physical space, in the real world, that they had been inspired by or rehearsed or somehow has a connection to VR. Like they've done it in VR before, and now they go and do it in the real world. And that will be a moment of reckoning. That's going to be a hard moment to deal with, because unlike the games that are in a rectangle, that you always know you're looking at a rectangle, you're not inhabiting these games, they're not trying to be reality. Virtual reality is trying to be reality. It is trying to be real to you. And when something that tries to be real inspires something atrocious, it's a different ballgame. And the moment is unfortunately inevitable, I think, and as creators and as people that work in this field, we're going to have to deal with it.
We have time for one more question.
Sorry, I was long-winded.
All right, who thinks they have a really good question?
I can ask one more question.
I got a microphone.
Everyone kept their hand up. All right, this guy's really excited. Okay, we already had a mic in the back. My apologies.
Hi. The human brain has the capacity, or humans have the capacity to adapt to many different environments. And it was interesting, the gentleman in the middle was saying that, right now we can fool the brain, and you do. You stand on the edge of a cliff in virtual reality and you step back. But have you thought about, will we adapt to that where we think that we'll be able to tell the difference? I mean, because we have been always able to navigate through our environment, so I'm just wondering if any thought has gone into how we'll really think about that. Will our perception change over time along with the technology?
That was you.
All right. Well, you can teach yourself to be able to step off those ledges in VR. It's a bad instinct to have in the real world, but you can do it. And yes, you can adapt to also perceive a virtual reality that obeys different laws of physics as real. You can train yourself for that to feel normal, just as astronauts learn to navigate in zero gravity and so on. Like humans are super adaptive. And there's bicycles that steer the other way, that inverts the wheel, and people learn to ride those bikes in 15 minutes. So we can train ourselves to do really weird things. We're already doing that in VR with eye convergence, because the screen is close, but we're trying to focus on something further away. And so we're already doing these physiological adaptations, and ultimately, I think we won't need them as much. The displays won't work that way. We will project light fields into our eyes, and we will have galvanic vestibular stimuli, which affects our sense of balance. Our inner ear is stimulated. Actually, Samsung has made a prototype headphones that do that, so that we can feel motion even though we're not physically experiencing motion. All of that is coming, so ultimately it's going to be imperceptibly different from real reality, where it's going to be internally consistent within its sort of physical parameters. So I don't know if that answers it, but I think it's cool shit, so I'm going to talk about it.
Great. Well, I think we're out of time, but our panelists will be around if you want to come up and ask your other questions. Yes. Thank you.
One more round of applause.